Welcome. This is the Free Market Roadshow, probably the largest annual series of public conferences on economics. Remarkable experts are discussing the challenges and providing libertarian solutions to today's problems. Organized by the Austrian Economic Center in cooperation with select institutes, universities and think tanks, the Free Market Roadshow tours all over Europe. Today we pay a visit to Warsaw.
Civil Development Forum is a non-governmental think tank based in Poland promoting and defending economic freedom, the rule of law, individual liberties, private property, entrepreneurial activities and ideas of limited government. Forum aims to achieve its goals through fact-based reports and analysis, efficient communication and civil society mobilization. Our think tank was founded in 2007 by Leszek Balcerowicz, who served as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance during successful economic transition in 1989. In 2013, we organized our first Free Market Roadshow in Warsaw. Civil Development Forum's work in Poland is visible in the fields of ideas and policy making, and our experts are regular guests in the media. We also cooperate with many freedom-oriented organizations in Poland, Europe and the rest of the world. While initial successes of Poland were based on free market reforms, we need to do more to close the gap between Poland and Western Europe that was created due to socialism. Civil Development Forum has been active during the current pandemic in analyzing policy responses and providing recommendations for the future recovery, which should be based on liberalization of the economy and strengthening of the rule of law.
Good afternoon, good morning or good evening as you can watch us in different time zones. Welcome to second Free Market Roadshow organized from Warsaw in Poland by Civil Development Forum. My name is Marek Tatala and I'm Vice President of the Civil Development Forum and I will moderate our discussion today. You are more than welcome to ask questions and you can do this on, for example, YouTube, and we'll try to answer them in the end of our panel. Today we are going to talk about the welfare policies and consequences of expanding welfare state. But before I introduce our speakers, we will hear a keynote speech by Barbara Kolm, Director of the Austrian Economic Center and President of the Hayek Institute. Barbara Kolm also serves as Vice President of the Austrian Central Bank.
I do care. Do you know the term lawnmower parents? It describes the attitude of some parents to avoid any possible conflict that a child could be confronted with. They protect their children from any kind of unpleasant experience. Sounds like a perfect childhood, a noble goal. Modern welfare states follow similar ideals. From the poor social standards of past times, a cascade of legislative and institutional implementations of the past 100 years have changed most societies to the better. Education, health care, social security are only some of the more obvious fields of the responsibility of a caring state. At least we think so. If you take a closer look, you might find that increasing welfare has led to less solidarity. We have simply shifted responsibility from the individual level to the corporate and institutional level. One must do something about whatever. One, but not I personally. Still, welfare is a good thing, and still we would do without what we deserve. The problem is, there is a price, not only in financial means. Much more, the price is freedom. The freedom of individual development. Paul Boltz, born in 1939 and died in 2006, an expert on developmental psychology, understood that development always means achievements and losses. The caring state covers the losses and by doing so, in last consequence, hinders us, just like the lawnmower parents, to learn and achieve the ability to deal with risk. Seldom a unique event has uncovered these problems at such an extent as the current COVID crisis. Almost all over Europe, political leaders have not considered self-responsibility as a response to health risk. True, it was a brand new risk and we knew little about its characteristics and consequences. But also true is that the people of Europe were obviously not considered as responsible and rational adults. Why? Did our leaders take a wise decision, knowing or suspecting that their people do not have the ability to deal with this risk? Were they right in assuming that much more than information, we need strict rules to follow? And did we prove them right when the slightest ease of the shutdowns led to increases case reports? If so, did they also take a minute to contemplate why their people are so indolent, show so little responsibility? Did one conclude that the decades of more or less soft guidance produced dependency? Anyhow, we were again taken care of. This time by massive lockdowns. By the way, a strange word for what it is meant, actually, a halt of living. It was clear that this decision would lead to an enormous economic consequence, and these would have to be at least eased by the state. Thus, the number of individuals that depend from the state was all of a sudden obvious, and not enough grew within a few weeks to an extent that has never been seen before in history. An interesting side note might be that those who have already received their salaries before the crisis directly or indirectly from the state, like public employees, retired social benefit receivers, public funded groups, etc., that those people tend to applaud the measures, while other groups take on the shutdowns very much dependent on how much they could adapt their businesses to the new situation. And if there was no adaptation possible, for example with performing arts, how much, if at all, government-provided funds helped to get through? In our understanding, the welfare state is to provide a living in dignity for all. This is why education and healthcare and caring homes and many other institutions and systems were created. After COVID-19, these institutions and systems will face legions in need. Our caring state has turned those who have until then tax-financed welfare into new dependents. Countless employees and entrepreneurs have lost their income. Many of them will rely on the state. Countless children grew up somewhere between fear, social distancing, and lack of education, and a deficit in healthy lifestyle. We can hardly imagine what consequences this has to their future health and careers. Plus, the weight of debts, which had already been remarkable high before, and that we silently pass on to future generations, has been increased to an unbearable amount. It might be unpopular to discuss welfare right in the middle of a crisis, and it would definitely not be a good idea to reduce it right now. But it is definitely the right moment to think of the unintended consequences of overflowing welfare. If you protect children from any possible harm and keep them from conflicts and boredom, they will not raise to responsible and self-insured adults. They will stay dependent from someone who takes the role of a protector. If the state acts like lawnmower parents, it must take the lead, even if it means to be protected against own will. I do care.
Thank you for this introduction. And as it was indicated by Barbara Kolm, it might be unpopular to discuss welfare policies right now when we still speak about COVID-19 crisis. Nevertheless, as it was once said, we should never waste a good crisis. And therefore, the pandemic might be an opportunity to think about the long-term perspective, sustainability of current welfare policies, and reforms of the welfare state that are needed. And I'm also sure that our speakers are not afraid of unpopular topics. And our guests today are Martin Ågerup, President and CEO of Center for Political Studies in Denmark, Mateusz Benedyk, Director General of Mises Institute of Economic Education in Poland, and Pierre Garello, president of IES Europe, who is living in France. And I decided to invite a representative from Denmark, as in Poland and many other countries, for example, we heard it from Bernie Sanders, Denmark is presented as a very successful example of welfare state. I also decided to invite a representative from France, as according to OECD, France had in 2019 the highest share of social spending as percentage of GDP, but it doesn't have an image, at least in Poland, of a very well-functioning welfare state. And we'll also have a guest from Poland so that our Polish viewers will also hear a local perspective. So I would like to start from Martin Ågerup from CEPOS and ask you, Martin, about your general perception about the welfare state. In Poland, we offer here that that the welfare is associated with solidarity, and that the expansion of the welfare state is kind of building government's solidarity. What do you think about the welfare and the welfare state in general, and how it is perceived in Denmark?
Well, you want the way I perceive it or the way voters perceive it? That's not entirely the same thing. But in general, the idea of the welfare state in Denmark, and I think in the rest of Scandinavia, is a little bit in conflict with what is actually happening. I think the idea is quite sensible, that you help people who are unable to help themselves. But what is in fact happening is that there is a lot of welfare spending that is being spent on people who are quite capable of taking care of themselves. And in some cases, actually in quite a lot of cases, there is so much spent on the sort of broad base of the population that very little money is left over for what should be considered worthy causes. So handicapped people in Denmark are not, I think it's generally agreed, not always helped the way you would expect. I mean, you can't, that's of no fault of your own if you are born blind or with luckily very few people are born blind, so maybe that's a bad example. But if you're born with a handicap, that's no fault of your own. And we're actually spending a very, very small amount on helping those people, and spending enormous amounts on transferring money from people who are quite well off to people who are almost as well off.
Thank you, Martin. And Mateusz, what do you think about the welfare state in general, and also this discussion in Poland that the true welfare state or European welfare state is true solidarity that is promoted by current government?
Good afternoon, everyone. I think that whether you believe that the welfare state is justified, you still should not be a proponent of welfare state, because it does not bring results it promises. To the contrary, if the welfare state promises to end the poverty, then in a few years you have more people who are in need of help. If the welfare state promises that unemployment will not be as unpleasant as it would be without unemployment benefits, then in a few years you get more people unemployed. If the welfare state promises that it will take care of people who are older, so they're not left without any money, then in a decade or two, you get more old people in need of help, because all of the mechanism of the welfare state discourages economic growth and makes us dynamically in a worse situation. So whether you believe it is a true solidarity or not, whether it's justified or not, you still should not support the welfare state, because it's just a bad policy. It doesn't bring ends that it says it do. So I would say that you should not be a proponent of any welfare state schemes at all.
Thank you, Mateusz. And the same question to Pierre Garello, and also about the perception about the welfare state in France. As I suggested, in Poland, we see that you spend a lot, but France doesn't have an image of the country which spends in a very efficient way the money on social policies. So what is your opinion on the welfare state and its perception in France?
Oh, okay, so what we are surely first at are, in terms of fiscal burden. I think we've been ranked #1 by the EU, by the OECD for this year. So public spending is about 57% of GDP in France. Now, this is not, also that means, of course, that we do have a lot of welfare state. Now, is it well functioning? Well, I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that, you have few people who really receive no help from the state, no access to health care or thing of that sort. So everyone has a decent access to those services. Now, that doesn't mean we are efficient, and I agree with Mateusz. I mean, maybe with the same money spent, we could have a much better services, including for the poorest. So, but it's true that if you visit France, you don't get the feeling that, a lot of people are. So, for instance, we have a lot of unemployment. If you compare to the average rate, we have about, officially a little bit above 8, probably rather around 10%, but most of the unemployed get a lot of support from the state. Okay. Now, I think what characterizes a country like France compared to countries like Denmark or like Sweden is not just welfare. It's also that it is a very centralized and technocratic state. And the state want to be in charge of a lot of things, including, the economy. And so they do believe in what, Mazzucato recently calls the entrepreneurial state. So they believe, the state should be the leader of, in any field, not only healthcare, but everything. So this is probably what characterizes France. Maybe the other things that characterize France, it's the focus on equality, and not equality of rights, but equality of income. It always bothers people a lot if some people are wealthy and others are 10 times poorer, which doesn't mean that they are poor in the absolute sense of the term. They have 10 times less income. Now, this being said, the impact of having a huge welfare and centralized state like this one for at least half a century, probably even more, is that civil society in France is very poor, and basically this sense of responsibility, as Barbara Kolm was mentioning, this sense of responsibility is becoming weaker and weaker, in this type of state. Now, the last thing, of course, that should be mentioned, I think, is that as you develop those welfare states, so social policy, what is sometimes called rights of the second generation, then the right of the first generation, property right, life, liberty, property, get weakened. And this is the case if only through taxation. If your property, if your the fruit of your labor is highly taxed, at some point, we might say that it's a direct attack on your basic rights.
Thank you, Pierre, and thank you all for this introduction. I would like to go back to Denmark now and enable Martin to criticize a bit some of the welfare policies that are present in your country. As I said, in Poland, and I am sure in some other countries, Denmark has an image of almost perfect welfare state. But can you give us some more specific examples where welfare state is doing more harm than good, where social policies are rather making situation worse? If not present, maybe some policies that were present in the past but were removed, so we can also have some lesson for Poland and other countries in Central Eastern Europe what should not be copied in our economies.
Well, let me first say that Denmark is a relatively free market economy. Don't misunderstand that, and that's true for all of Scandinavia. The Scandinavian countries are actually probably more different than most people watching this from outside Scandinavia would think, because we speak similar languages, we look similar, and there are many similarities as well, but also some differences. So bear that in mind. I'll focus on Denmark, and I can't say too much about the rest. But Denmark is a free market economy. We have very little production that is controlled by the state. If you ignore, the welfare sector, education, healthcare, care for the elderly, and look at sort of industrial production, the service sector, most of that is private. Some of it that did belong to the state, like telecommunications was privatized, and a lot of production is outsourced. We are currently in a transition to on trains, where more and more train services are being outsourced, or at least put to competition between the national company and private companies. So and we have a very open economy. We have a flexible labor market where you can fire and hire employees at ease. We have very free salary formation in the labor market, and you can go on and on and on. So if you look at the economic freedom indices that exist, Denmark is pretty high up, despite the fact that we have a very large public sector and very high taxes that pulls us in the opposite direction. So you can look at it in this way. Denmark is a relatively well-functioning country because we have these two things balancing each other out. We sin in terms of the size of the public sector and the taxes, which are very high, but then we compensate for that by having a very free market private sector that is quite efficient. So I think that's the first point. The second point is that we have very sound public finances, but that's because we've had an era of economic reforms that has been going on for like 40 years or something. So we built we didn't really get a large public sector in Denmark until the 1950s, the 1960s. It wasn't really until the 1960s where it really started happening very, very quick. In 1960, we had lower taxes, we had a lower total tax burden than they had in the US at the time. And then we built the welfare state. And by 1970, so that's 10 years later, we were in severe trouble. And by 1973, we had the oil crisis. It was a very, very severe situation. And by the early 80s, we started a reform process that's been carrying on for really 4 decades now. And so we've reformed labor markets. We've cut a lot of both the length of time that you can be on unemployment benefit and the size of the unemployment benefit for some groups have been cut. A lot of transfer payments have been reduced. We have increased the retirement age, and we've indexed the retirement age so that as longevity increases, as people live longer and longer, we automatically increase the retirement age, the official retirement age. Obviously, you can retire whenever you want if you have the money, but the official retirement age where you get a public pension is later and later. And someone like me, I can't remember the exact time, but I can't expect to get a public pension, which is, by the way, going to be a relatively small amount, before I'm 70 or something like that. So, you need to bear that in mind. very free market and a lot of reforms that have been moving Denmark in a free market direction. We've more or less privatized, not completely, but we've more or less privatized our pension system. Most people pay into their private pensions with their own money, and most people, certainly my generation and towards the future, rely mainly on their own funding for their pension later in life. So that's just a few things. What remains? Well, a lot of stuff. Mainly getting more competition into healthcare, care for the elderly, education, and getting rid of the monopolies there, and getting more private funding into those parts of the welfare state as well. And that needs to happen over the next 10, 20 years, I think.
Thank you, Martin. And I think it is important to remember that Denmark and other Scandinavian countries already had some level of prosperity before this expansion of the welfare state, because we often hear in discussions about transition in Poland in 1989, why they didn't apply the Scandinavian model. But we were one of the poorest region of the whole post-Soviet bloc, post-communist bloc. So there was no welfare to create it. There was no money to distribute. We were an extremely poor country, and it is important to have it in mind that Denmark and other countries are already at some level of development when this expansion started. And
yes,
speaking about
copying.
Poland,
Sorry, and copying any country is difficult. And one of the things that is true for all of Scandinavia is that we have very low corruption. And high trust, and if you build a very large public sector, and you have a certain amount of corruption in your country, that's not going to be the same as having a large public sector with low corruption. That's a very, very different situation. So don't try this at home.
And the scores of Poland in the end of communism in terms of corruption or trust were really, really poor and really low. And speaking about Poland, I would like to ask Mateusz, where do you see the most harmful parts of the Polish welfare state, the social policies which do the most harm in terms of Polish economy and society?
I believe that still the worst is before us, and the recent expansion of the welfare state we've experienced in Poland has not fully we're still not feeling all of its consequences. And I believe that the most dangerous thing about the welfare state is it discourages entrepreneurship. And so far, since 1990s or late 1990s, I think Poland was blessed with a lot of entrepreneurial talents. Like they started their companies in garages or small shops, and now some of them are becoming multinational corporations, very competitive in world markets. And I believe that we might see the end of that development if we will proceed with the expansion of the welfare state, because entrepreneur is the driving force of the market, as Ludwig von Mises said. And in order for entrepreneurs to be so they can fully realize their talents, they of course need good institutions, good courts, stable system of property rights, but they also need a culture where their success is celebrated and not discouraged. And welfare state promotes routine, promotes stability. It does not promote risk-taking innovation. So I believe that if you get more of welfare state, if people will become more and more dependable on government handouts, we will see less entrepreneurial talents utilized in market economy, and our economic progress will be stalled.
Thank you, Mateusz. And I would like to ask also Pierre Garello about some lessons that we can learn also in Poland from France, where social policies really failed in your country, and what we shouldn't copy in Poland. Can you give us some examples?
Okay, I think the contrast with Denmark is really interesting. Now, we do have, of course, some free market, some degree of free market in France. I mean, you need to be able to afford socialism. I mean, socialism is very expensive. So even though we use, I'll say a few words about that. We use, public debt and our government run deficits as they press. Still, there is some free market. Okay, so let's not get a totally wrong picture. Now, this being said, since 1945, I mean, we should keep in mind in 1945, the political party number one in France after World War II is the Communist Party. We have central planning for the years after World War II. We nationalized almost everything. That's where we set up this huge social security system in the 40s, in the late 40s. So some free market, but on top of that, and this huge burden of a huge debt. But the free market is there. Otherwise, again, we will have been bankrupt long ago. Bankruptcy might be closed, but we avoid it. Now, a few words about public finance then, or maybe before. The things get bad in France because, indeed, just as Martin said, in many countries in the 80s, government realized that some new direction had to be taken. Okay, so that we should not get invaded by the welfare state. Okay, now in France we didn't do those reforms. Just think about pension funding. Most of the pension is still a pay-as-you-go system, public pay-as-you-go system. Okay, very few people, unless the wealthiest one, will put money aside. I mean, the usual technique of a French guy would be to try to buy the house. So at least he will have the house when he will retire. He will own the house. But no, those private insurance schemes. I mean, this is just it's marginal. Okay, so that's most of the things that could have been changed in the 80s were not changed. And as you know, it's very hard now to just make those turns because we are, especially in the public sector, strong unions that make things very difficult to move. Now, public finance is a big mess. I guess your next question might be about what is next. Well, in France, just to give you an idea, since 1974, each year the parliament votes a finance law with a deficit. So the deficit is something which is planned. Okay, so when they vote, they say, okay, this year it's okay, we're going to spend 4% more than our income, and so on and so forth. So of course, usually they often, the deficit is even bigger than the one that was planned. But we never voted a balanced budget since 1974. So like 50 years. So that gives you the mentality. And as a result, of course, is that the public debt is booming. So now I think we probably, with COVID, we've reached something like 120% of GDP. So, the kind of Italian debt before COVID-19. And I see no way that this trajectory, which is rather exponential, could change slope. Now, as Mateusz said, whatever the government does is usually a failure. So we have a huge housing program, for instance, and we lack housing. I mean, the housing market is a mess. We have probably the most centralized and nationalized education system in the world. If we put aside some, North Korea and a couple of countries like that, we have, for instance, almost no private universities. This is unknown in France. We have a few non-funded and free to choose their program private schools, hospitals. I'm not sure about the figure, but I feel like 70% of them, more or less, are run by the state, by the public administration. And I could go on and on like that. Now, labor market is also a big problem. I mean, it's very regulated. Contrarily, we don't have this flexibility. So sometimes our government mention it, but we never get it. This is a part of things that are difficult to move. So France put together a very complex system. Some people are kept out of the labor market basically because of not only the minimum wage, which is this kind of high for someone, a young guy, for instance, without much, competencies because he's young. But besides the minimum wage, it's very hard to lay off employees. So, you think twice if you're an entrepreneur before hiring someone because, it's going to be, if the business doesn't go as well as expected. So we have all those rigidity, which put together make it really difficult to move things forward. And I think a lot of people are kind of tired of that. But I think you still have an important part of the population who feel they have a duty to go and go to work, and they support basically all that system. For how long, I don't know.
Thank you, and I hope in Poland we will not copy many of practices that were already tested in France and some other countries in the West. And you are right. I would like to speak a bit about the future, but also the current situation with COVID-19. Many governments, including Polish government, use COVID-19 to present some kind of post-crisis recovery plans. And on the one hand, this type of post-recover or post-pandemic recovery can be used as an opportunity to reform some welfare policies. We had examples of some reforms after the previous global financial crisis, but also it can be used as justification that because COVID-19 showed that in these types of crises, many people depend on transfers, maybe we should even expand the welfare state more. So I would like to ask Martin, what is current discussion in Denmark about the welfare state in the context also of COVID-19 and recovery? Do you see that it will give some room for, create some room for opportunity for reforms, or maybe some new programs are discussed because we need to be ready for future similar health emergencies?
Yeah, it's a big question. Can I just say first, as you were speaking, I just checked the Economic Freedom Index, the one by Heritage Foundation, and Denmark on the latest issue is number 10, and Poland is number 41, and France is 64th on the Economic Freedom Index, and Saudi Arabia is just in front of you. Yeah, that's unacceptable.
That's no surprise.
Do something about it. So that's obviously that's just an index, and it's picking some parameters, and you could argue that other parameters should be in there. France doesn't feel like an unfree country, obviously, when you're there, but in terms of economic freedom, it's not. I prefer living in France to Saudi Arabia, I have to admit, any day, but. And it's a great place, but you're really doing something with your economy there. And Poland has a way to go as well, mostly free. Anyway, you were asking about COVID. It's hard to tell. There's been some. It's been a very weird situation, and it's hard to know if this was exceptional circumstances and it will just go away now, or if this has formed the foundation of something very different and, to my mind, sinister. I think it's very hard to tell. But there is a risk that this will be used as a foundation for all kinds of new regulation, and whenever there's a severe flu season or something else, that crops up. It's as if there's a new normal in terms of what you'd expect the state to do to achieve some kind of common goal. And it's hard to tell where this is taking us. In terms of economics, I'm an economist. Denmark is in a situation where we didn't have much debt when the thing started, and all the spending as long as it's not going to be permanent spending, as long as it's temporary, and I think it's going to be temporary, there isn't a new problem in terms of funding the welfare state. So we don't have to increase taxes to fund it. We had an epidemics law when this whole thing started, saying that you need to compensate businesses if you shut down the economy or if you shut down parts of the economy. So, and we'd had that for 100 years. So this was not a new idea that you might want to shut down something if there was a serious epidemic. But what happened overnight was that parliamentary majority got rid of this law and said, now we don't have to compensate business anymore. Now we will pay them help packages. So the whole thing was transitioned from being sort of a rule of law thing, where if you are locked down by the state and you lose business because of that, you have a legal right to a compensation. That was changed to now the state will help you. That's ominous, and that's not the way it should have been. And in fact, many businesses have been undercompensated and others have been overcompensated. So you have this thing going on, which is unfortunate. I don't think it's going to move in the direction of subsidies for businesses carrying on and on and on. We don't have a tradition for that. But I'm more concerned about civil liberties, that it will be acceptable in the future if something happens, if there's a terror attack or a new epidemic, that we will see disproportional intervention. I agree that there should be intervention in a situation like that, but the thing has been completely out of proportion, and there's been very little debate about proportionality, which is a very important principle in a liberal democracy with the rule of law. So we've had a situation where it's been acceptable for the government to introduce things without even putting forward an argument for why this is proportional. And that's the thing that worries me the most.
Thank you, Martin. Mateusz, you already expressed your concerns about the expansion in the future. So are you worried that we will have social spendings in relation to GDP as in France in the future? This is our target, the target of our politicians?
It's quite possible if the election calendar will look like that. I mean, like with every election, there is new social spending, and it's been a rule for a few elections now in Poland. So I guess that with every new parliamentary or presidential election, we will get new social spending, and some of them will become permanent, unless, of course, people will protest it. And it's hard to make people protest government handouts, but it's still possible. So I will not lose faith that we can stop it. But I don't think that COVID will help that much for our government. I think there are deeply mistrust. We have one of the highest rates of like excessive death in pandemics, for like the one of the biggest in Europe. So it shows that the country government-run healthcare is not functioning well, and the markets actually like performed really well. If we needed masks or if we needed sanitizers or anything else, it was very quickly produced and distributed to the market and sold at really cheap prices. Yes, like during when Polish government decided to make a mask mandate, that you need to wear masks even outside, they also announced at a similar time that they will build a government-owned enterprise that will produce masks. So people can't afford cheap government masks. But fortunately, before they started producing, already entrepreneurs were able to provide cheap masks, so these companies were never started. And I hope that will be the case with most of the programs that are now being proposed. Because it doesn't make economic sense to make more stimuli for the economy. Once you lose COVID restrictions, the economy is booming, and it's happening now in Poland. All of the indicators show that, and there's really like no more like potential GDP to be maximized. We are already close to the potential, so we have like the lowest unemployment rate in Europe, so it doesn't make sense to like make more government spending in the economy. I'm like not a fan of Keynesian economics, but now it doesn't make sense even on their own terms. So we need to show that it's just ridiculous. It's not needed. We already see inflation going up, and with more active Polish central bank and more active Polish central government, we will pay a heavy price if we will try to expand the state or the welfare state now.
Thank you, Mateusz. And what about situation in France, Pierre? Is COVID-19 used as justification for even more government and more welfare state? As I said, you already had the highest expenditures on social policies in the OECD or EU. So is there room for more?
Well, I don't know. It's France, I think, is really getting in trouble now. And when a country starts to get in trouble, and I will say why exactly what I mean by that, but I think it's very difficult to predict, the direction that things will take. When you are in a normal situation, I mean, when I listen to Martin, it looks like Denmark, had to face a crisis, but they were on the clear track. So probably, I mean, without too much. But France is really, I think, a little bit in the middle of a mess. We have elections coming as well, presidential elections, which are by far the most important one in France next year. So it's very, very difficult to predict, honestly, what's going to happen. My fear, but let's hope I'm wrong, is that they will try to impose even more welfare state. There is this ratchet effect, that Bob Hicks talked about. I mean, usually when you see the expenditure from the state increase, and it's, we see our sorry, there is a big thunderstorm where I live. When you see your prime minister and your president, almost 3 times a week on TV, you kind of get used to it. There is it's a little bit like, some, I don't know, some, I guess, country with dictatorship. We see those guys on TV now for the last year and a half, and people almost get used to that, to see them. So I'm afraid that we will unfortunately get out of the crisis with more welfare state than before. Now, the direct aid, which was very, very important in France, I think, once again, one of the most important during the COVID-19 crisis, this will probably be stopped. Okay, in France, for instance, the state paid the salaries to all the workers that were not able to go to work. Not just the public servants. I mean, everyone, all the businesses that were closed received money from the state. So that they will stop, but they are already starting a plan for recovery and restarting the economy and so on and so forth. Of some hundreds of billions of euros. I'm skeptical. Probably, the way you read it through the news is that after the COVID, now we're going to be talking only about the Green Deal and environment. So this is going to be the new Trojan horses for the states like France to just keep public spending at a very high level, and not only public spending, but all kind of interference with the economic business. Now, will people, take that burden? This is, as I said, very hard to guess. First, because people are not well informed. We keep hearing every day on TV that France is one of the best countries in the world. 2 days ago, for instance, a figure was out saying that France was country number 1 in Europe in terms of foreign direct investment, ahead of the UK, and I think third was Germany. So they say, you see, France, everyone wants to come and invest in France, and this was on the news all day. France is a fantastic country. All the world wants to come and invest in France. Now, there was not a piece of analysis trying to understand that figure. There might be many reasons, like, when you run a current deficit, there might be a lot of reasons why you run a deficit, or when you attract foreign direct investment. But no economic analysis, nothing. But in the mind of the people, France is great. You hear a lot in France things such as, oh, we have lower growth, sure, but we have less income inequality. So where do you want to live? We have a better social security system. Now, again, this is not checked, but it is in the mind of a lot of people, and that's why it's going to be hard, to convince enough of them to change direction. Now, some people are a bit sick and tired of paying taxes. We had a tax revolt. Maybe you remember the yellow jacket a little bit before COVID-19. The problem is that people, they were really upset because they had to pay huge taxes on gasoline and on cars and all of that. But basically, they just went down to ask more money, not to ask less states. They just want more aid. So far, the tax revolt have not been, in favor of more free market, less state intervention, but more in terms of more aid, more subsidies, more. So, I mean, you hear me. We never know. But I'm at that point. I'm rather pessimistic. The coming presidential election in a year or so will probably tell us a lot about the next direction.
Can I ask a question?
Thank you, Pierre. Yes.
Pierre, is Macron, will he be running on a reform-oriented platform? Is he still trying to achieve reforms, and what's happening with that? Because he wanted.
Well,
I mean,
he wanted. He's trying now to say, I will try again. Just before COVID, they passed the law reforming, but it's not a huge reform, but reforming the pension system. Okay, it was not a huge reform in the sense that it remains a pay-as-you-go system, but the way that you work more, you earn more points, and so it was getting a little bit closer to a saving system. But still, it was, and right after that, they had a huge demonstration, and then the COVID came. So now he's putting again on the table that reform of the pension system. That's something he wants to do before the election. And the unions already start to say, that's not a good idea. We should not have that reform just before the election, and so on and so forth. So even that now, the way he campaign now, like I think it's becoming a common with many politicians, is that he has a very incoherent program. You just send messages to attract a little bit of those voters, so there will be something on the environment, then there will be something on business, but it doesn't sound like giving you a perspective, the type of country I want, the type of value I want to defend. They don't do that. They just send little spots here and there, say, okay, here I'm getting 5%, here I'm getting 10%, and they sometimes think about immigration should be controlled, but at the same time, so that's really the way they do politics. It's very boring. I mean, it's because there is no value. They don't put any value or any reform on the table. But he did that. You are right, Martin. He did it previously, but he didn't deliver.
Okay.
We have some questions from our viewers, so I would like to ask at least two. And this one will be to Martin. And you said also about the private sector involved also in outsourcing of some services in terms of welfare policies in Denmark. So the question is, how big is a problem of crowding out private help by government welfare, and is there any way to avoid crowding out this private sector without abolishing government welfare?
So I understand the question this way: if the government moves in and has activities in a certain field, it will push private initiative out of that field. And I agree, and that happens in several ways. One is that if you can get something paid by the taxpayers, you're not going to pay for it on your own. And the other way is that certain activities are run by local municipalities, for instance. They will prefer their own providers. So the local municipality has to decide who should do this, and they produce it themselves. But they could get it cheaper and better from a private provider, but they don't want to do that because they have their own. So they're wearing they have several different hats they're wearing at the same time. And it's really a kind of corruption. I just started saying we have low corruption in Denmark, but it's a kind of built-in corruption into the system, and that's a huge problem. So we have private hospitals in Denmark that in many ways, not in all, but in many ways are cheaper and better. And we're not talking a little cheaper, but a lot cheaper. But they still only comprise 1 or 2%, I think it is, of total production. Whereas in Sweden, it's the last figure I saw was 13%, and France has many more private hospitals than we have as well. So there are huge issues there, and it's in certain sectors that we've had some outsourcing, but in many sectors we haven't had. It's especially in the private industrial production and the service sector. More or less everything is private, but in the welfare sector, a lot is public, and there's a bias towards public production that's really, really harmful to competition, quality, free choice, and innovation.
We also have question to Pierre. Two questions. I won't let you to answer the first one because it's very general and it will require the whole session, because the question is about the prospects of liberals in France. But there is a more specific question from Federico Fernandez. Why do you think people don't like civil society inequality, but seem not to mind a huge public sector and bloated budgets in France?
Why? I'm sorry. Why they don't like civil society inequality?
Yes, but like big government.
Okay. Well, the future of liberals in France is I don't know. It's in the short run, I think it's not really rosy. There are more. There are always been, a little network of free market liberal thinkers in France, and they are more visible now than they were, let's say, 30 years ago or 40 years ago. So you start to see them in the media. You've got more think tanks. There are more books that have been published. So the ideas are floating around, and this is good. Now, probably not enough, I think, to have a kind of a liberal party, a classical liberal party or libertarian party in France. So probably the strategy, that's what some of my colleagues, liberal, have in mind, will be to try to keep the best candidate and to say we will give our votes to that guy. But we, like the community, if you wish, or the people who are, free market minded, okay? Because it's, he has a program which is more compatible with our values than other programs. So that's my answer to the first question. As for the second, civil society and state, I mean, this is a long story. I mean, you can read Tocqueville. It was already there in France, like in many countries. In the 19th century, most of those associations between the individual and the state were just forbidden. It was, you could not have any union, you could not have any gathering, you could not organize anything. Now, and in France, that was really imposed strictly, not like in England, for instance, where they could develop the friendly societies and things of that sort. So it's a long tradition. The state being the nanny, the nanny state is an old story in France, so to speak. And to some extent, the result of that is you get a country which have a very strong sense, I think, of individual liberty, because the individual is one of the two important groups, and the state also is important. So what is missing in the middle now? Again, what I'm saying here is relative to other countries. I mean, we do have associations in France. I mean, it's not a desert in terms of civil society. But the idea that we could organize ourselves and find is probably not powerful enough. I mean, we should work on reviving that.
Thank you, Pierre. As we are running out of time, I would like to ask the final question to Mateusz and ask you for a short answer. When you heard the stories today from Martin and Pierre about the welfare state expansion in the West Europe, and also you for sure read a lot about this topic, what is, in your opinion, the main lesson that Poland should take from failures and some successes of welfare policies in the West? In the Western Europe?
I think that we should be warned about the dangers of the excess welfare state, and we should not be humble in criticizing the welfare state and what it brings about. But I think that it's also important to remember that from time to time there are crises like the one from Denmark mentioned, when there is a serious need for reform, and I really do hope that it will happen soon. I think it would have happened around 2011 with the public debt crisis, but unfortunately, European Central Bank decided to bail out all of the countries with huge debts. If not, they would have to make some structural reforms and limit the welfare state. And this very unconventional zero interest rate policy of ECB cannot last forever. It's consumption capital, not consumption accumulation, and the reserves of capital will come to an end, and we will have a crisis. And I'm afraid it's rather sooner than later. And there will be need for reform, and I hope we will be ready with some good ideas on how to make it the most radical we can hope for.
Thank you, Mateusz, and thanks to all of you, to Martin, Pierre, and Mateusz for joining us today for this discussion. I see in the chat that we were not only viewed by people in Poland, but also very international audience. So I hope it was interesting for all of you. And I would like to invite you for the next Free Market Roadshow event that will take place tomorrow, June 10th at 5 p.m. and it is organized in Stockholm and hosted by Svensk Tidskrivet. The keynote speech will be given by Krasen Stanchev on non-intended consequences of regulations, what we have forgotten since 1989. You can watch this event on YouTube and find more information on Free Market Roadshow website. Thank you once again, and I hope to see you soon also in person in some events in Europe or in the world. Thank you and have a nice day.
See you.
Thank you, Mark.